Well, as you know, we've been going through the book of Daniel, for those of you that have been here. And the book that we're using, if you want to go much deeper than we can go here in the session, is this book by John Lennox, who is an Oxford professor. It's called Against the Flow, The Inspiration of Daniel in an Age of Relativism. And Lennox's book goes into great depth, and he applies a lot of it not only to what's going on today, but he also throws a lot of what we call apologetics in there, evidence for the faith. And so it's a very valuable read. It's quite a long read, but a very valuable read. So if you're interested in going further in the book of Daniel, you need to get this book, Against the Flow. It might be an audio, too. Does anyone know if it's an audio? It might be an audio. So if you do a lot of driving, check that out. Lennox is just a wonderful guy to listen to, a wonderful guy to read. Here's an overview of the book of Daniel. You know the book of Daniel is in the Old Testament. And there's two basic sections to the book of Daniel. As we've pointed out before, chapters 1 to 6, Daniel's ministry in Babylon, and then 7 to 12 is Daniel's vision for the future. And when we talk about Babylon, let's get our geography correct. Babylon is way over here. Current day Baghdad is right here. So this is, 50, 60 miles to the southeast of current day Baghdad. 52. Thank you, General. 52 miles exactly. Lat long, please. Targeting. That's right. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It's nothing now. It's just a desert practically. As you know, as the General taught us last time, there's a couple of palaces that Saddam tried to build there. He only, I think, finished one of them. And that's pretty much been ransacked ever since he was knocked out of power. As you can see, Jerusalem's way over here, so that when they were taken into exile, they went this route and right down into Babylon, hundreds of miles away. We pointed out as well that the first 6 chapters are comprised of these events. Daniel doesn't defile. That's the Daniel diet. We've covered that, chapter 1. Then we covered interpreting the king's dream, chapter 2. Last time we were in idolatry and the fiery furnace. Tonight we're going to talk about chapter 4, the king's second dream and conversion. Then on the 14th we'll get into the handwriting on the wall. And then in the spring, or when we kick this off again in January, we'll talk about Daniel in the lion's den and then go further. Let's just review very briefly the lessons, the basic overview of the first 3 chapters, just so we can see where the book is going. Remember, in chapter 1, Daniel did not want to defile himself. He wanted to remain unstained by the world. And he said, look, King Nebuchadnezzar, I don't want to eat your food, even though it's really good. I don't want to drink your wine. I want to do things my way. And it turned out okay. He didn't get hammered for that. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and the dream turned out to be interpreted by Daniel. And what was the unique thing about Daniel? Not only did he interpret the dream, what did he tell Nebuchadnezzar? He told him the dream. I mean, imagine that. His enchanters, his magicians, they said, oh, just tell us the dream, great king, and we'll tell you what it means. And he said, no, I'm not playing that game. You tell me what the dream is, and then tell me what it means. And so, amazingly, Daniel, because of God, was able to tell him what the dream was. And this is the interpretation of the dream that most commentators will say what occurred. The head, as you know, was Babylon itself. Then Medo-Persia was the arms of silver. Greece, the belly and the thighs. The bronze belly and the thighs, and then of course Rome, the legs, and of course the everlasting kingdom is a rock that comes in, not made by human hands, which crushes all the other kingdoms. So that was the interpretation of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. And then last week, a couple weeks ago, we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When Nebuchadnezzar sets up the image, he says, you must worship this image. And they say, we're not going to do this, king. And he says, I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. And they go, we don't care. We're not going to do it. Our God will rescue us, but even if he does not, we're not going to bow down. So they weren't guaranteed that they would be rescued. They were under no illusions. God could have allowed them to be burned up. And it's amazing today, people out there running around saying, oh, God's going to protect you. No, he's not. He might not. I mean, he might, but he might not, right? Many people, many Christians are right now being executed. In fact, there's on average 10 executions of Christians around the world per hour. That's 1 every 6 minutes. As we sit here, there are going to be 10 people giving their lives for Christ as we sit here tonight, on average, right now. So God is not always going to protect us, but in this case, he did protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And of course, most commentators believe that this is Jesus, the pre-incarnate Jesus, called a Christophany in the Old Testament, where Jesus appears to engage in some kind of protection. And in this case, he protects Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the flames. And they come out without even a singe, not even a burn, not even the smell of smoke on them. And Nebuchadnezzar goes, wow, this is amazing. Your God is amazing. Now, a couple of points we want to make about the first two, or the chapters 2 and 3. Notice that chapter 2 points out that man's power is limited in time, and chapter 3 says it's limited in scope. What do we mean by that? Well, in chapter 2, Daniel says, Nebuchadnezzar, look, your kingdom's going to end. And there's going to be an inferior kingdom that's going to take over after you, Medo-Persia. And in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar says to these three guys, who's going to save you? There's nobody that can save you from what I'm going to do to you. Guess what? God does save them from what Nebuchadnezzar tried to do to him. So his power was limited not only in time, but also limited in scope. The same is true today. We've got leaders running around doing all sorts of crazy things. In fact, what is one way that God ensures that certain evils are ended? What does he do? He allows people to die, or he kills them directly, right? Imagine in our fallen state if we never died. Imagine if Hitler was still running around. Good way to end evil is to get rid of evildoers. And God will do it eventually. So, chapters 2 and chapter 3 give us the idea that man's power is limited in time and scope. Let's go back to chapter 3 for just a minute before we get to chapter 4. Remember, he said, worship the image or you're going to get the fiery furnace. Here's my question, is just to kick this off as a point of discussion. If this happened to you, what would you have done? You know what my answer is? I don't know. Do any of us really know what would happen if we were put at the point of a gun or a knife or a furnace and said, you either blaspheme Christ or you're going to get this? Do you really know what you'd do? I mean, I hope I would do the right thing, but would I? I don't know. Have a heart attack? Just that's what you do, Jeff. Just have a heart attack and not have to deal with it. What would you do?
Hasn't that happened with some of the mass shooters that have gone into college? You know, I can't remember which.
It has happened, like Rachel Scott. Darrell Scott's her father, who's been a speaker since 1999, Columbine. She was asked by the gunman, are you a Christian? And she said, I am. And so he shot her. It happened recently in, what was the college it happened at recently? A college in Oregon, I want to say. I think it was a community college in Oregon. He's just started shooting Christians. Of course, the media doesn't really report much of this. If he was in there shooting Muslims, what do you think would have happened? Well, that would have been totally politically incorrect. But yeah, it happens. It happens today, even in America on occasion. What would you do, Greg?
I'm with you. I would think that I would do the right thing, but I don't know. And if I didn't, I just don't know how I could live with myself.
Right.
Like, that would probably be worse than going in the furnace.
Living with yourself after not doing the right thing.
Well, do you think God would forgive you?
Yes.
Oh, God can forgive you for anything. Sure, yeah. The question is, what is your absolute value is the question.
Well, what would happen if you just didn't say anything and then he shot you anyway? You died.
Well, I mean, this isn't a matter of salvation. You could already be a Christian and do the wrong thing and still be saved. The question is, what would you do? That's the question. In fact, let me just make it a little bit more relevant today. What do you do now when faced with a choice between following what you know God wants you to do and what the culture wants you to do? I mean, I could submit to you that we all on occasion just go with the culture, don't we? Because we don't even want to put up a fight. We don't want to put up we don't want to in any way jeopardize our position because we don't think it's worth it.
Fear of man. Fear of man.
Fear of man, of course.
We were talking about that one time a while ago about work, coworkers,
Sure.
Looking down on your faith,
Yep.
anything that.
And it's getting more and more restrictive. It's even getting more and more restrictive on college campuses. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this to you last time, but at the University of Michigan a few weeks ago, the Campus Crusade director there, after the event, which attracted a lot of people and seemed to be a real positive event overall, he emailed me back and he said some of the students were offended. By what? Well, when you talked about Islam, you didn't say that all Muslims are not terrorists. Okay. But I never said all of them were terrorists either, right? And when you made a joke about the fact that in the New Testament, it's not a joke, it's actually the truth, it just turns out to be funny. In the New Testament writers write down that the men ran away while the women were the brave ones. Now, who's going to invent that? What man is going to invent that he ran away while the women were the brave ones at the crucifixion? No man's going to invent that, right? No man's going to say he was Mr. Sissy Pants while the women ran away. I mean, while the men ran away. He was Mr. Sissy Pants. He ran away with the other men and the women were the brave ones. No one's going to invent that. And I said that, and somebody was saying, are you saying that women can't be brave? That was the feedback. That was the feedback of these students.
They're so in tune to that.
Yeah, they're so in tune to that. And then a Muslim asked me a question he was asking me, can you apply the tests of the New Testament to another book like the Quran? I said, sure, you can apply them. I said, I don't think the Quran meets the tests for truth, for veracity. And I said, first of all, there are no miracles in the Quran. Muhammad says, I don't do miracles. I'm just a plain warner. And he said, and this is a classic Muslim retort, well, the Quran itself is a miracle, the book. And I said, well, if writing a book makes you a miracle worker, I've done 5 miracles, right? And they said, oh, that was kind of a slam on him. No, it's just the truth, right? Yeah. We're getting so hypersensitive on college campuses that it may get to a point where somebody like me is not invited there anymore. Just because. So what I'm thinking in my heart is, oh, maybe I got to tone things down, or maybe I got to not say certain things. Well, there is some truth to that. If times are changing, you don't want to be purposely offensive. But on the other hand, you don't want to dilute the message because some people may not like it. Everett Piper, who's a friend of mine, he's the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. So it's an evangelical Christian school in Oklahoma. Just came out recently on a radio program somewhere, and I hate to use the term it went viral, but it did because it's overused. It was actually on Fox News today. It said, the headline was, University President Slams Selfish, Narcissistic Students. And he said, look, when you go to college, it's not daycare, it's a university. You may be challenged in what you believe. And that's true. But what's the tendency now for speakers who want to get invited to campus? Well, we're just going to be PC now, right? We're not going to offend anyway. We're going to make sure we caveat everything we say. So there's a tendency for all of us, I think, to do this. The question is, what do we do?
See, Frank, just getting, and I don't mean this derogatory, you know how much I respect you, but it's even got you thinking, maybe I need to tell my, and that's how we've got to this point.
Right. Well, the question is, I want to be careful because I don't want to tone down the message. How the message is given can always be changed, right? Yeah, how do you deliver it so more people will not be automatically turned off by the message? Okay, so there is a certain, as Christ himself said, right? He said we have to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. So you will have to caveat how you put the message as long as you don't compromise the message. But aren't we all apt to rather compromise our message or compromise our beliefs to avoid potentially getting in trouble at work or fired or getting a dirty look or whatever it is? I think we're all apt to do that.
Yeah, but I think also, Frank, though, is just an example of what you're doing helps people like us stand our ground, because now we have a better foundation of our understanding, and the more you believe something, the more you stand up for what you believe. Whereas if you don't have that backbone, I think what you're doing with the kids, with like university kids, gives them a better foundation to be able to stand on the ground and stand and confront people when they do it, as opposed to just saying, oh yeah, I'll just run with everybody else because it's just easier.
Right.
If they have a foundation and then they have a better understanding, I think that helps people.
Oh, it certainly does. There's no question about it. The question, though, is how do you get them that foundation without unnecessarily creating offense? Because the gospel is offensive already, right? The gospel is offensive already. So the question is, how do you go about doing that? And I'm open to changing in order to do that, because we don't want to... Look what Paul did this, right? Paul, when he went to different places, he used different tactics, right? When he went to Mars Hill, he didn't preach from the Hebrew Scriptures. They didn't believe in that. He preached from their own worldview. Hey, you got this unknown God here? Let me tell you about the unknown God you may have forgotten. He didn't even bring the Bible into it. He quoted their own pagan poets. So we have to be open to changing how we present the message, but we can't compromise the message.
I think a slower introduction also, smaller messages, like in increments, rather than one just...
Sure. And culturally, it is in our culture, it's you don't talk about two things. What are the two things you don't talk about? Religion and politics, which are about the only two things worth talking about. How are we going to live here politically, and how are we going to live ultimately if there is an afterlife? Those are the two things that govern everything we do. So it is Satan's world, isn't it? You don't talk about the two things most important in life. How you're going to live here and how you're going to live in eternity if there is one. Anyway, let's just keep moving. Just keep this in your mind as you're going through the week. I mean, this is extreme, right? There's no way of skirting this. You're either going to bow or you're not, but we can quietly skirt stuff and nobody knows. Because they're not asking you, hey, are you a Christian? Hey, what do you believe? Hey, they're not asking you that directly. You're just not saying anything when maybe you should say something. Go ahead.
You know, it's funny, I look at that picture, and it reminds me of, Tim Keller when he talks about the idols that we worship. So when you ask what have you done? Well, we're doing it all the time because we're setting things up as idols. Our career, other people's approval, all those idols that we set up, and we worship them every day.
Yep. Keller's great on that. If you ever want to, Keller works idol worship into everything he does, and he's in the middle of New York City. The guy's brilliant. Look him up, by the way, Tim Keller. And by the way, on an app, the app you want to get for Tim Keller is called the Gospel Coalition. If you get the Gospel Coalition app, it's not just Tim Keller, there's other folks on there. What were you going to say?
Well, about him, the prodigal God, that's pretty good.
Oh, the prodigal God's great. Last thing, Jerry, go ahead, then we got to move.
A lot of what I think about studying apologetics and worldviews is the reason we study that is to learn ways of engaging people who have a different worldview than we do.
Yes.
In a way that is not attacking the person, but is getting them to question their own ideas.
Remember the 3 questions we talked about a couple of years ago? First question, when anybody ever says something, what do you mean by that? Next question, how did you come to that conclusion? Or how do you know that's true? Or what evidence do you have for that position? Third question, have you ever considered, and then fill in the blank. All this is in the app, by the way, the Cross-Examined app. It's also in Greg Kokel's book, Tactics. But just having those 3 questions in the front of your mind when you're talking with somebody is very helpful, because you don't have to refute what they say. If they say something, they have to support what they say. So you say, what do you mean by that? What do you mean tolerance? What do you mean by bigot? What do you mean by homophobe? What do you mean by the Bible's been changed? What do you mean by evolution? What do you mean by all these things? What do you mean by you have a right not to be offended? Do you realize you're offending me by saying that I can't express my worldview? See, it's just crazy if you think about it. Just keep asking questions.
Can I just add one more thing? Go. With Christians, what I see going on a lot is a lot of, I think, they say and do things to too much of an extreme, and I think that pushes a lot of people away. I just noticed lately, just like the cup,
Yeah, I mean,
things like that, it kind of gives Christians a bad name and it turns people off, and you just see that kind of more and more going on.
It's like, as Keller has said, he said, Christians in the public square, 90% of the time we say something that's either cowardly or obnoxious. That's right. It's either cowardly, we cave to political correctness, or it's said in such a way that it's just obnoxious. So we have to be better diplomats without compromising the message.
One last thing. Been working through Acts right now, the ability for the Holy Spirit to help you out in situations like these too, if you just pray to the Holy Spirit, or just kind of meditate and let the Holy Spirit kind of take you where you think you need to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, we forget about that. We have a comforter, we have a spirit that can help us out. Here is what Nebuchadnezzar said in the previous chapter. After they said, we're not going to bow, praise be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve and worship this false god. What are you going to do if this ever happens to you? What are you going to do? Think about it now. Think about what decision you're going to make now before you have to make the decision. Military is great at that, right? What's going to happen if X occurs? This is what we're going to do. Airplane, emergency procedure, this is what we're going to do. We're not even going to think about it. It's just going to happen. So think about it now. As Christ said, what good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? A lot of times we're trying to gain the world and we're forfeiting our soul to do it. Yeah, isn't that paradox? There's so many great paradoxes in the Christian faith, isn't it? Isn't there? He who seeks to save his life will lose it. It's a paradox. What do you mean? Deny yourself to find yourself? All right, let's dive in now to chapter 4. This is the king's second dream and his conversion. This section of the Bible might be the only part of the Bible that's actually written by a pagan. Because chapter 4 of Daniel is actually written, or at least it's the words, most of the words, of Nebuchadnezzar, believe it or not. In fact, that's why Lennox says chapter 4 is the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, the great king from the Babylonian area. And he was king for about, let's see, I want to say about 42 years. Took over in 605, do the math. I have to look it up, but in about the 560s or so, he died. So he was king for quite a while. And here's what happens with Nebuchadnezzar. The chapter starts with a doxology, and it ends with a doxology. What's a doxology? In Greek, it means a glory saying. So he's giving praise to God in the first few verses of chapter 4. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar says. To the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. This is coming from a pagan king who destroyed the temple. By the way, these events in chapter 4 occur probably about 30 years after the events of chapter 3. So Daniel is about 50 years old when this happens. How do we know? A number of reasons. One of the reasons is the place is basically at peace. He's not fighting Egypt anymore. Babylon is built. So it's late in his reign when he is saying things like this. Notice how it's my pleasure to tell you about what God has done. Do we as Christians, do we take pleasure in telling other people about the work God has done in our lives? Here's a pagan king who, by the end of this chapter, is probably a believer. But he wants to tell everybody about what the Lord has done. So that's the opening glory saying of the chapter. And then he says this, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous, like most of us are. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. What were the images and visions that passed through his mind? Well, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a great tree, a tree that filled the whole land and could be seen, according to him, from all parts of the earth, right here in Babylon. A huge tree, a colossal tree. And this tree nested all sorts of different animals, and it provided food for just about everything out there. It was a colossal tree. However, the dream progressed where a messenger came down and said, cut this tree down. Cut it down? Yeah. Cut the tree down. And then this messenger, this angel, whatever it was, said this, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Wait, Nebuchadnezzar's going, time out. Who's him? Who's him? Let him? What is this him business? Because it's not explained right here in the text. Let him be drenched? Okay. And then let his mind be changed from that of the mind of a man and let him be given the mind of an animal. Till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of men. So Nebuchadnezzar is going, wait a minute. I got this big tree. It's amazing. Someone says, cut it down. This messenger says, cut it down. And then this guy, whoever this guy is, this him, is going to be drenched with the dew of heaven. He's going to be given the mind of an animal for 7 times. Most believe it means 7 years. And this, so everyone's going to know that the Most High God is sovereign. Here's the theme of Daniel right here. We've said it several times. What's the theme of Daniel? God is sovereign. God reigns over all. No matter what's going on here on earth, God's in control. He's sovereign. So Nebuchadnezzar is terrified because who's this guy that's going to be, this tree's going to be cut down and this guy's going to be given the mind of an animal for 7 years? Who is this guy? So he calls in who? His magicians. I guess he hasn't learned yet. These guys didn't do squat for him in chapter 2, right? But he calls them in anyway and says, yo, he even tells them the dream. And what do they say? Well, we got no idea, oh great king. Well, let's call Daniel in. Let's call Daniel in and see what Daniel has to say. So he calls Daniel in, and he says, this is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, the word for Daniel, or the name for that they had given Daniel, remember, what does this mean? We talked about it in chapter 1. It means Bel, protect this man. Bel was another word for Marduk, which is the chief god of the Babylonians. So his name now means basically Marduk, protect this guy. Okay? Tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the spirit of the holy gods, he still seems to be a polytheist here, the spirit of the holy gods is in you. And it goes on to say that Daniel was appalled. And he didn't want to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream meant. Why not? Wasn't good news. Okay? Was not good news, and he didn't want to tell, but Nebuchadnezzar said, yo, Daniel, Belteshazzar, don't worry about it. Just tell me what it means. So here's what Belteshazzar, Daniel says. He answered, my Lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies. And its meaning to your adversaries. So he's kind of just He's trying to let him know, he's trying to let him down gently here. I wish this applied not to you, but to your enemies. It's like, it's the old saying, you know, when you greet the king, "Oh, king, live forever." Well, he's saying here, I wish this applied to your adversaries, but let me go tell you what it is. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the beasts of the field, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds of the air. You, O king, are that tree. You are the tree. Does that remind you anything? Not you are the tree, but you are the man. What's that from? David. That's David. Nathan and David. Remember, Nathan, the prophet, has to go in and tell David that he sinned. And he tells this whole story about this guy this rich guy that had all of these sheep, yet he saw his neighbor's one little sheep that the neighbor had as a pet and would sleep with and take care of and nurture. And that one rich guy wanted to have a party, so instead of slaying one of his own lambs, he went and stole the one little lamb from his neighbor. And so Nathan asked David, what should we do with this guy? And David said, that man should die. And Nathan said, you are that man. Applying it to David and Bathsheba. Whoa. Imagine saying that to the king. He had already wiped out Uriah, right? Bathsheba's husband. Nathan was taking a big risk, wasn't he? Well, Daniel's taking the same kind of big risk. Instead of you are that man, you are that tree. Well, what's this business about the tree being cut down? Well, he goes on with more good news. He says, you have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to the distant parts of the earth. But then he hits him with the bad news. You, O king, saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live like the wild animals until 7 times pass for him. He's that man. He's that man's going to be drenched in dew. Why is he going to be drenched in dew? Because he's going to live like an animal. He's not going to come in at night like human beings do. He's going to be out in the fields, and he's going to be drenched in dew. And it's going to happen for 7 years. He's going to get the mind of an animal. This is what Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to be you. He goes on to say, this is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. Now, what is this exactly? He says this, you will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign, there it is again, over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Basically, he was going to become almost like a werewolf. In fact, this is a known medical condition. Zoanthropy is a mental disorder in which a man believes himself to be an animal. In fact, R.K. Harrison, an Old Testament scholar, once investigated this a little bit and found out that there was one man who for 13 years really thought he was a cat, yet he still held the job down. It's something called monomania. You can have a mental disorder and still function.
I think there's people like that today.
Sure there are, yeah.
Tattoos, they tattoo themselves like a cat.
They tattoo themselves like a cat. They think they're a cat, and yet they're holding down jobs, probably on Broadway, aren't they? They're holding down jobs somewhere. Now, I want you to think about this for a second, though. Think about what's going on here. Here's Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's telling him the dream. He holds his hand out and he says, wait. Imagine him saying this. Daniel says this to him, and then Nebuchadnezzar said, let me get this straight. First, you don't want to eat my best food. Then secondly, you tell me my kingdom's going to end. Then thirdly, your buddies who came here with you don't want to bow down to my image. And now finally here, you tell me that if I don't recognize and acknowledge your God, I'm going to become a beast-like freak show for 7 years. That's what you're telling me, right? That's right, King. Imagine that. That's what he said. Yeah, I'm going to become like this? Yeah. And he goes on to say, the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules, God's sovereign. Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness. Imagine telling the king, you're wicked. Renounce your wickedness. Imagine somebody going to Saddam Hussein and saying that, who thought he was Nebuchadnezzar reborn. Renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be then that your prosperity will continue. Being kind. Nebuchadnezzar's going to be cut down like the tree until he acknowledges who the true God is. That's what's going to happen, unless he repents. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has already seen what? Miracles. He's already seen miracles. I mean, he does find favor in David, but he's probably fickle. Why? Because we're all fickle. We may have seen even miracles in our lives, and we go, I wonder if God exists. Right? I mean, you probably, you certainly, if it's not a miracle, you certainly had God intervene in your life at some point, some way. Maybe just his divine providence. You know God has been there for you on certain occasions directly, and you're going,
Is it fickle or is it pride?
well, it could be both. I think in Nebuchadnezzar's case, it's going to be maybe both. I don't know. But here's my question. Did Nebuchadnezzar immediately repent? He'd already seen what the true God can do, and he didn't immediately repent. Now, why not? Maybe pride. Maybe he's fickle. Maybe it's both. You know what Nebuchadnezzar did? Here's his great city, Babylon, which he had built. 12 months later, 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, wow, is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Uh-oh. Oops. Oops. Let's go back to when we talked about Proverbs last year. You remember some of these Proverbs we highlighted last time? One of them was, the proud and arrogant man, mocker is his name. He behaves with overweening pride. I like that word, overweening. It means excessive, arrogant, over the top. That seems to be like Babylon, or I should say like Nebuchadnezzar, right? Overweening pride. And the famous, probably one of the most famous proverbs that are quoted even by unbelievers is this. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Pride comes before the fall, the short version of it. So what happens to Nebuchadnezzar? The very next verse says this. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven, this is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. And for 7 years, apparently, that's what happened to him. That's what he did. While the words were still on his lips, God gave him 12 months to heed his advice, and he still didn't do it. God is patient, long-suffering, not wanting any to perish, but to all to come to salvation. But yet, we're prideful, so we're not going to do it. Now, notice one kind of parallel thought here in the text. The text doesn't say this, but I think it says it in other parts of the Bible, and that's this. When people reject God or worship false gods, they often lose their reason and behave like animals. In fact, what is the social pressure, the cultural pressure we have today? The cultural pressure we have today is for us to act like animals. That's what it is. You're not anything but an animal. Especially when it comes to sex, right? You're just supposed to treat sex like the animals treat sex. It's just a recreational activity. Of course, the animals do it for procreation. But we're supposed to do it just for recreation. And we're not supposed to treat anybody as special because we're just overgrown germs anyway. We just got here through some non-intelligent process. There is no God. People are just going to follow their hormones. This one young lady told me that her father only had 2 rules in his house. Rule number 1, never depart from the will of God. Rule number 2, don't let your hormones overrule your reason. Pretty good advice. But the world wants us to live like animals, doesn't it? Why? Because it makes them feel better when they're living like animals. It's not just that miserable company loves more miserable company. They need more company, like to confirm what they're doing. And by the way, this is true of all of us. I'm not talking about just the people who are unbelievers. We do this sometimes too, right? We want people to affirm our sin. We want people to tell us what we want to hear because we want to go our own way. In fact, let's take a macro view of this over the past couple centuries. The Russian novelist Dostoevsky wrote in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov, if God is dead, everything is permissible. Why do you think he said that?
There's no values.
There's no objective values. Whatever you want to do is fine. Whatever you want to do is fine. There is no overarching value to life. There is no afterlife. There is no right or wrong way to live life. If we're just overgrown germs, do whatever you want. Now, one of the greatest atheists of the past couple centuries was Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, as you see, lived only about 56 years. He died of syphilis. But he was an honest atheist. What do I mean by an honest atheist? He said, look, if there is no God, nothing's right or wrong. You try and get atheists today, try and have it both ways. They try and say there is objective right and wrong even though there is no God. And Nietzsche pointed this out. He said, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? Why did he say this? Because in the 1800s, the late 1700s, the 1800s, when he lived, there was a rising tide of skepticism in scholarship, particularly about the Bible, biblical criticism. And it was really based on presuppositions that there is no God, there is no supernatural. Most of it came out of Germany, called German liberalism. And so Nietzsche said, God is dead, we've killed God, by pointing out that the scriptures can't be true. There is no God. So we've killed belief in God. We've killed him. Nietzsche predicted, believe it or not, that the 20th century, and look when he died just as the 20th century began. He said the 20th century will be the bloodiest century in history because we've killed belief in God. Now, for him, that was a good thing. He didn't want there to be a God. He said if one were to prove this God of the Christians to us, we should believe him all the less. What? Was it an intellectual problem with Nietzsche? No, it was a volitional problem. He didn't want there to be a God. You mean if you could prove God, you shouldn't believe in him? Yeah. What? But he knew the implications of killing belief in God. Here were the implications. In the 19th century, God died because man killed God. What I mean by this is we killed belief in God, not that God's actually dead, you understand. But in the 20th century, man died. Man killed man. The bloodiest century by far was the 20th century. I mean, just take a look at the top 3 murderers of the 20th century. And these are, by the way, these estimates, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, these estimates of people killed are probably low. Now you say, well, Hitler claimed to be a Christian. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, he did, yeah. He claimed to be a Christian. David, who was it? Yeah, it was David Silverman in one of the debates I had with him, and he tried to say that Hitler was a Christian. I said, oh yeah, I'm sure Hitler was a Christian. Yeah, his maxim was, first of all, he was worshiping a Jew, and his maxim was love your neighbor as yourself. I don't think so. No, that wasn't his maxim. He may have used religion for illicit gain, but he was obviously no Christian. Of course, these were committed atheists. Now, it doesn't mean that just because someone's an atheist, they're going to act this way. That's obviously not true. But this is the logical outworking of atheism. Why? Because this is all you got here. And if there is no judgment, there is no right or wrong, there is no afterlife, you might as well kill other people to get what you want. Why not? If you're going to say, that's wrong, where are you getting that from? Right, it's wrong by who? Just by you? And by the way, it's not just atheism that is a problem, it's worshiping false gods. What's the greatest false god we have going on right now besides ourselves? That's really probably the greatest in America. It's Islam. It's a false god. Killing in the name of God. In fact, let's take a look at a scripture that we talked about many years ago in this session. It's Romans chapter 1. This is probably the most relevant piece of scripture that describes what's going on in our culture right now. Romans chapter 1, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who do what? Suppress the truth. We suppress the truth about God. Why? Not because we don't think there's a God. We know there's a God, as we're about to see, but because we want to do our own thing. We suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. There is no person out there who doesn't know there's a creator God. Many people don't know about Jesus because we haven't told them about Jesus, but everyone knows there's a creator God and a moral creator God. Why? Because the conscience that's written on our hearts. Romans chapter 1 talks about the creator. Romans chapter 2 talks about conscience. Everyone knows there's a moral creator God out there. But we suppress the truth. Why? Because we want to be God. Because we don't want there to be an authority above us. Because we want to do our own thing. He goes on to say this. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. In fact, this, believe it or not, is the key to happiness right here. Knowing God and giving thanks. You can't be happy if you don't give thanks. If you're not someone who has gratitude, you're never going to be a happy person. You're going to be a bitter person. They didn't give thanks. Even, I think it was Nietzsche. Nietzsche felt like at times in his life he was grateful, but he just didn't know who to thank. He had nobody to thank. There was no God. They didn't give thanks to him, but their thinking became what? Futile. Thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, birds, animals, and reptiles. This is idolatry here. Their thinking became futile. Now, I'm not talking just here about unbelievers. We do this too. Have you ever been in sin? It's easier to see if you're not the one in sin. If somebody else is in sin and they're making stupid decisions and you're going, how could you be doing this? This happens particularly with illicit sex. People make the craziest decisions. How can you not see this is disaster? Why? Because their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. The more you sin, the easier it is to continue sinning and continue sinning to a greater and greater degree. In fact, if you keep reading in Romans chapter 1, we won't go there now, but if you keep reading, you get to the end of this chapter, what does he say? He says, these people not only continue to do these things, they give hearty approval to others who do them as well. Again, company just doesn't like company. Miserable company likes more miserable company. You've got to get approval for what you're doing. Look at the sin movements in our culture. They're all about getting approval. Planned Parenthood is trying to say what they're doing is good. Cutting up babies in the womb and selling their body parts is a good thing? Is that the futilest thinking you've ever heard? People are trying to say same-sex marriage is good. Homosexuality is good. Good? Futile thinking. Now, remember we had Jim Wallace in here, the cold case homicide detective? And he was talking about the cold case principle of the motive for any crime that anyone commits. And he said there's only 3 motives. Do you remember what they are? Money, sex, and power. These are the 3 motives that drive just about everything we do, if you think about this. By the way, there's very strong scriptural support for this. Where does it come from? It comes from 1 John chapter 2. What does he say in 1 John chapter 2? Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away, and also its lust, but the one who does the will of God abides forever. Do you see, these 3 things are expressly delineated right here in the Scriptures. Now, the boastful pride of life, power, pride, that is the ultimate sin. The ultimate sin. We are attracted by things that are actually good things, but used illicitly, they're a disaster. In fact, John Lennox, in the book that you're supposedly reading, he says the proper use of our aesthetic sense should lead us to God himself, who is the ultimate source of beauty. But if our aesthetic sense or anything else becomes our master, it can drive a wedge between us and God and lead us into much evil. That's certainly true, isn't it? When we do evil, as Keller would say when he talks about idolatry, we're actually pursuing a good thing because money, sex, and power are good, but we're trying to take shortcuts to get them. We don't want to go God's way. We want to go our way. We want to get them illicitly. So, as Lennox said, if we get anything before God, particularly things that can divert us away from him, sex, money, or power, it will be a disaster. In fact, someone put it this way, I can't remember who it was. Beauty is the ground upon which God and Satan fight for the soul of men. Think about that. Because when you sin, you're trying to pursue or trying to get a good thing. You never sin for evil purposes. You always sin because it's going to bring you or someone else you're trying to help something good. You don't sin for sin's sake. You sin because it's going to give you something good. And so beauty is the ground upon which both God and Satan fight for the souls of men. Now let's go back to Daniel chapter 4. Here's how it ends up. At the end of that time, Nebuchadnezzar's writing this again, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. You say, how could he do this? He had the mind of an animal. Remember, you could be in a condition like the guy who thought he was a cat and still hold down a job. You could still have reason. You could still have the ability to think, even if you're doing some crazy things. So at some point, Nebuchadnezzar finally came to his senses and he repented. And here's how he finally put it. He said this, a doxology at the end, a glory saying at the end of the chapter, his dominion, God's dominion, is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of all the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Translation, God is sovereign. No man can complain about what God does. Paul even says this, as you know, in Romans chapter 9. Who are we to complain? Nebuchadnezzar ends the chapter this way. He says, at the same time, that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. In fact, he was given his kingdom back, and he prospered even more greatly. And he went on to say, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So what lessons can we take from this? I think, first of all, The first lesson we can take is that God reigns over all, even those who appear the most powerful in this life. God reigns over them. He allows them to do what they do, but at one point there's going to be a judgment. In fact, pride, the ultimate anti-God attitude, is the root of all sin. Even pride is the root of the sins involving sex and money. Why? What is pride all about? I want to do it my way. I don't want to do it God's way. I want to do it my way. That's the ultimate anti-God state of mind. I want to do it my way. Now, by the way, when we're talking pride, we're not talking about, well, I'm proud of my son or my daughter or my wife or somebody I love because they have these admirable qualities. We're not talking about that kind of pride. We're talking about the kind of pride that says, I want to do it my way, not God's way. That's what we mean by pride. That's what C.S. Lewis said. He said, pride is the root of all sin. It's the ultimate anti-God state of mind. I want to get something that I want more so than I want God. Finally, God will ultimately humble the proud, which includes what? Includes all of us, doesn't it? We're always thinking of somebody else when we think of the proud. Yeah, that guy, that gal, that person. We never think of ourselves. But he's going to humble us too. He humbled Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar actually, it appears, became a believer. He wrote a chapter of the Bible. Think about that. That's pretty amazing. This is all about Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most attested to kings from the ancient world. As you know, and 90% of the bricks found in Babylon, his name was there. We know a lot about Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, it appears, became a believer. Now, this is toward the end of his reign. So he's restored to his kingdom, and maybe he reigns another year or two, and then he dies. And we'll see what happens to his kingdom when we get to the next chapter. And the chapter after that. We'll see what happens to his kingdom. Actually, chapter 5 talks about what happens after he passes on and who takes over for him, and then what happens. The writing is on the wall.
The preceding program was brought to you by crossexamined.org. The average